Good afternoon. I'm Jim Bauman. I'm the managing editor of the Daily Herald. Today is September 9th, 2020, and I'm pleased to begin a joint interview with candidates for the 14th Congressional District in the November 2020 election. I'm joined by Daily Herald reporter Russell LaSalle and Daily Herald editorial board members John Lampinen, Jim Slusher, Diane Dungy, Pete Nenny, Lisa Miner, and Robert Sanchez. Also with us today is John Stife and John Etheridge from Shaw Media. They represent their editorial board. We are doing this jointly to save us some time and to save you some time as well, but we'll be forming our own opinions and publishing our own editorials on this. Anyway, we welcome the candidates, incumbent Democrat Lauren Underwood and Republican challenger Jim Oberweis, who's a member of the Illinois State Senate. Representative Underwood, we'll start the questioning with you. Do you view this election as a referendum on President Trump?
Well, thank you for having me today. I'm really delighted for the opportunity to be with you. I do not believe that this election is a referendum on Donald Trump. I believe that we have made extraordinary progress in the 14th Congressional District here in my first term in Congress. We have had the opportunity to work with the Trump administration in a bipartisan way to get 3 of my bills signed into law, including one to lower insulin prices. And so we have a lot of important items that are really relevant to the 14th Congressional in a hyper-local way that we have in contrast between Mr. Oberweis and I think that that will dictate who wins this election. It's not about Donald Trump and Joe Biden.
Okay, very good. Senator Oberweis?
We found something we agree on. I don't think it's about the president either. But quite frankly, I think it's about the fact that my opponent has run 2 years ago like a moderate Democrat, but since then has voted like a radical socialist. She has refused to call for Mike Madigan's resignation, even though she said earlier last week that she wanted to help clean up corruption, and yet she has a joint fundraising account with an account controlled by Mike Madigan. She's refused to call for Mike Madigan to step down, even though obviously there are federal investigations going on. She refused to call for Terry Link to step down, one of my fellow state senators who happens to be the Democrat Party chairman in Lake County. And she's refused to condemn the destroying of businesses, the looting and rioting that has gone on. And she refused to defend the police in the situation. Certainly there have been some mistakes that have been made, no question about that. But for heaven's sakes, to somehow imply that that's then okay to steal everything out of a business who had nothing to do with that, that makes no sense whatsoever. Her views might be okay maybe in San Francisco. They aren't okay in the 14th Congressional District, and that's why I'm running. She just does not represent our views or anything close to it.
Representative Underwood, care to respond to that?
Well, I think that, my opponent has been using his time to lodge character attacks, and I've been spending my time as your representative focused on the issues and focused on serving this community. We've had 20 town halls in 2019. We've had a dozen this year. We've set up 9 constituent advisory committees and have really taken the opportunity. I'm sorry, we had 15 town halls in 2019. Let me be really precise. 15 town halls in 2019, a dozen this year, and taken the opportunity to hear directly from the constituents of this community. I set out at the very beginning of my term to be the most accessible, transparent, and responsive Congresswoman that this community has ever seen, and we've certainly delivered on that.
Lauren, if I could clarify something, you mentioned at the top of the interview that you work in a bipartisan manner and that 3 of your bills have been signed into law, which is something that you also said during the St. Charles Forum. It's not 100% true, though, and I wanted to ask you about that. 3 of your bills were adapted into other pieces of legislation that were signed into law by the president. Is that correct?
3 of my pieces of legislation were signed into law. As you know, in the United States Congress, individual members have the opportunity to draft pieces of legislation. And in fact, sometimes there are large bills. We call them omnibus bills. Sometimes they're appropriations bills. Sometimes they're just conglomerates of ideas that get moved through the legislative process. And so I think that it's important to work in a collaborative way with my colleagues. But when we talk about legislation and original legislation, I'm really proud of our record of success.
Okay. Very good. Thank you.
May I comment on that too?
You may. You may.
Yeah. Look, my opponent has voted 100% of the time with Nancy Pelosi. We've asked for, just give us any single example where you disagree with Nancy, where you've not voted with Nancy. And I realize Nancy has raised an awful lot of money for my opponent. So maybe therefore she owes her loyalty, but her loyalty should be to the people of the 14th Congressional District, not to Nancy Pelosi. And you can't in any way pretend to be bipartisan if you vote 100% of the time with Nancy Pelosi.
How about one last response from you, Representative Underwood, and then we'll move on.
There are many areas that I do disagree with the Trump administration, but we found a way to work together in a collaborative, bipartisan way on issues important to this community, like immigration, like healthcare. And so the three bills, for folks who don't know, one is the Lower Insulin Costs Now Act, which makes generic insulin available on the marketplace sooner. The second is one to implement an electronic medical record. It's interoperable, so we no longer have children dying in federal custody along the US-Mexico border. And the third was one in the COVID package related to our reliance on the foreign medical supply chain, which is an incredibly important national security issue, particularly during a pandemic. I mean, when we face national crises, we do need to work together. And I think that our record clearly demonstrates my effectiveness in doing so.
As Russell pointed out, these weren't the individual bills that were passed. They were incorporated into larger legislation that was in fact passed. But my question wasn't that. My question was, where have you disagreed with Nancy Pelosi? If you vote 100% of the time with Nancy Pelosi, how can that possibly be bipartisan, for heaven's sake? She's about as partisan a person as in the entire Congress.
Here's a point where I remind you that we're not talking to each other, we're talking over each other. Okay. Anyway, I think the question's been answered. So let's move on to another question. Senator Oberweis, is there systemic racism in the United States?
Well, I guess that it depends entirely on how you want to define that. It seems very clear that there certainly have been instances of that. No question about that in my mind. And I've tried to work very hard personally and professionally to overcome that. One of my very best friends is Pastor Corey Brooks in Chicago. This is just one incredible human being who grew up in Muncie, Indiana, moved to the worst parts of Chicago in order to try to help that community because it was one of the most violent parts in Chicago. 6620 South Martin Luther King Drive on the border of Woodlawn and Edgelawn, Englewood neighborhoods. That guy does more to help people in this community than anybody I can possibly imagine. And I've tried to support him in every way that I can, including driving Oberweis Dairy milk trucks in to support the food drives that he has had from time to time. So are there instances of that? Yes, I don't think there's any question about that. We all have to work together to try to solve those problems. That's what I've done in my life. That's what I've tried to encourage my children and my grandchildren to do. And I'm very proud of the way our family has been supportive of those types of efforts.
Thank you. Representative Underwood.
I certainly do think that the United States does have systemic racism throughout our country. We've had 400 years of a legacy of slavery in this country. And as a result, there are continue to be challenges that we have to overcome. This summer, we've seen our country have a national conversation about race and racism and white supremacy and Black Lives Matter. And I've been so pleased to see so many individuals kind of examine their own roles within these systems, the companies and organizations that they're affiliated with, but also come together to affirm that we want to have true equality and equity and justice for all. And I think that that is something that indicates that our country is moving in the right direction. And I think that it's important when we talk about shared values here in this community that we affirm that we have diversity, diverse perspectives, people's race and religion and country of origin and native language. And if we're going to be a welcoming community for everyone, as we certainly espouse ourselves to be, then I think that it's incumbent on the community's representatives to face the realities of systemic racism and other injustices head on.
Okay. Thank you. John Stife?
John Stife with Shaw Media. Is there a need for police reform? If so, will it require an overhaul or merely tweaking? We'll start with you, Representative Underwood.
Yes, I have been, again, so pleased about, the rallies and protests and calls to action, affirming in this way a message of equity and justice. And particularly after the murder of George Floyd, I do think that the country was eager and hungry for policing reform. These types of reforms that I've championed in the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, the bipartisan legislation that we passed in the House of Representatives in June, has important reforms that will help our community here in the 14th Congressional District. We're talking about items like centering transparency and accountability that would require body cameras, that would ban chokeholds and carotid holds, that would require the use of lethal force only in the extreme, most necessary situations, and require documentation and transparency around that use of lethal force. Reforming qualified immunity. All of these provisions have broad support here in our community and across the country. And that's why I think that we were able to receive that kind of bipartisan support in the House of Representatives. Policing reform is something that helps all of us. I think that there's been this characterization that would suggest that it's just for certain urban communities or communities of color. But even when I think about the 14th Congressional District and the opportunities for improvement, particularly around body cameras, I think that this type of legislation would be welcomed and warmly received.
Senator Oberweis.
John, thanks for the question. I think it's a great and certainly important question. I think that we should all agree, regardless of politics or party, that when we see something wrong, demonstrating or protesting against that wrong is absolutely the right thing to do and should be supported by all of us. That shouldn't be a Republican or Democrat issue. I think we should universally agree on that. But I also think that we should universally agree that those mistakes that a few people make in no way should lead to groups of people burning down businesses, destroying businesses, looting, rioting. Again, that should not be a political issue. Republicans and Democrats alike should certainly be agreeing that that is wrong and unacceptable. My opponent doesn't feel that way. I mean, she's talked about that as being a beautiful example of moving towards racial justice or something of that nature. That to me, that's just craziness. That doesn't fit with this district whatsoever. When I first saw some of this looting going on in Chicago on North Michigan Avenue, a month or two ago, I thought, wow, this is really crazy stuff. I sure hate to be a small business owner who just had my business totally destroyed. But I called Pastor Corey Brooks, my friend, and said, you've seen that on TV. Thank goodness it doesn't happen in your neighborhood. And he said, absolutely, it's happening in our neighborhood. He said they literally broke into every single grocery store and every pharmacy in both of those neighborhoods. And the stores are closed, and now people have no way to get fresh food. They have no way to get their prescriptions filled because many of those people in his area don't have a car. They're used to taking public transportation. And that's why he organized one of the first huge giveaway events where they actually provided vegetables and fruits and protein, and a company donated books so that parents could read those books to their kids who were obviously staying home because there was no school. And I drove an Oberweis dairy milk truck in there. I stood there for 3.5 hours giving milk to those people who were in need. And there were two lines, one line of cars pulling up from station to station to get the different products, and one line of people walking down the street pushing, grocery carts or wagons or whatever else they could to help get the food back home when they didn't have a car. It was a lot of work. It was a hard day, but boy, I left coming home feeling we had really done something very positive. And I think that's critical that we respond in that way to help people, that we understand that there are some mistakes made, that, and those policemen who make those types of mistakes need to be punished. I filed legislation in Springfield requiring licensure of police officers because too often in those cases where some of those cops make mistakes, even if they're bad guys who do it intentionally, they're protected by their union and defended by their union. And even if they do eventually get fired, they can turn around and go get a job in, I don't know, Kalamazoo or Cincinnati or something different. Under my proposal with licensure, they would have to take additional step to stay licensed. And that provides an outside governing body, if you want to call it that, or oversight, so that if people really do some of these bad things, they won't be able to maintain their license. They won't be able to go get a job in a different community. So I think that's the right thing. We've got to root out whatever bad apples are in the barrel. But to try to then say that every cop or every policeman is somehow guilty of association, I mean, that's crazy. What we're doing is heading towards a society trying to, I think my opponent and some on the extreme side are trying to have us lose trust in our police staff, say that we're going to start over, we're going to fire every policeman and rebuild in a different fashion. That to me is sheer insanity, and we just can't allow that to happen. That will lead, unfortunately, to something much worse, and that's the vigilantes then saying, hey, police aren't going to protect me, I'm going to protect me. Just, you know, that's kind of what happened, I think, in Kenosha. And my gosh, that was an individual coming from Antioch who was in our district. We can't allow that stuff to happen.
Representative Underwood, a few times he's brought up looting and whether you're for or against that or any response to that. Do you have any response in that realm?
Well, my response to what Mr. Oberweis said is that he's obviously spent a lot of time talking about Chicago. And the work that I've done has been really focused on the communities here in the 14th Congressional District and the reforms in the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which was your original question, John, do respond to the requests for reforms coming from this community. And so I just want to put a point in it that this was a bipartisan piece of legislation that the House has passed. It's not a proposal that's gone nowhere. This is something that has the broad support in the House, and that we're hopeful that there is a path forward to get this signed into law this year. With response to some of the violence that we've seen after these protests, you know, we've seen significant violence, damage, injuries, and unfortunately deaths. You know, what happened in Kenosha was heartbreaking. And this young man from our community, the fact that he was traveling across state lines with a weapon, and you know, something that should never happen. And that's why I've been such a strong supporter of things like the assault weapons ban, because these weapons of war do not belong in our communities. And no one should feel their life being threatened at work or at school, or even in a peaceful protest. There's no reason that weapons should be brought to protests. And I think that you know, we obviously have a ways to go as a country when it comes to uniting together and folks having these important conversations. But, you know, I want to be very clear that my comments on policing reform are in response to the requests that we've heard from people in the 14th District.
You just touched on something, Representative Underwood. My next question, Senator Oberweis, is tell us your thoughts about gun control, including assault weapons.
Well, first of all, I certainly am a supporter of the Second Amendment. I believe that that's part of our heritage, our history, our Constitution, and I stand in support of that. But I think there are reasonable restrictions that can be applied to that, and I have voted for some of those restrictions in Springfield. As I go to Washington, I will continue to evaluate those very carefully to have a balance between protecting our Second Amendment rights and a balance for what is necessary to keep our society safe. again, the worst situation we can get to is where we have vigilantes who want to go out and feel that they have to defend their property. That's something that should be left up to the professionals. That's why the police are there. They are trained. Maybe they need more training in some cases, but I would support that. I'd support the training, but we have to be very forward-looking and avoid these situations where people are now going to stand on their property with a gun and decide they have to protect their business or their home from those who want to do harm. And you know, once again, I wish my opponent would just come right out and say, I absolutely will condemn the rioting and looting that's going on. But unfortunately, Lauren and the squad, those people just will not make that statement that this is absolutely wrong. Under no circumstances do you have the right to break into somebody else's business and steal and loot whatever they have, or throw Molotov cocktails in and start fires to burn down those businesses. This is just wrong. The people in my, you know, I've been going door to door and talking to people. This is becoming the #1 issue. They're concerned about their future. They're concerned about their community. They're concerned about what is happening to their police departments. And if my opponent hasn't talked to people, if she hasn't been out knocking on any doors, you know, just having a few seminars, you know, by Zoom, that doesn't do the job. You don't get to feel what people are really believing. And I've done town halls, several of them myself also. They're great, they can be informative, but you don't get that feedback where people are really concerned about what's happening to our country and to our own district.
Okay. Senator, what specifically are your thoughts about assault weapons?
There is no good definition of assault weapon. And, you know, we've gone around and around this. Certainly, we have to be very, very careful and very concerned. As I said earlier, I do accept reasonable restrictions on those, but nobody's been able to ever give me a good definition of what you mean by an assault weapon.
Well, let's talk about the AR-15. Does that have a place in American society?
Isn't that one of the most common weapons that is used for competition, even in some cases for hunting?
Okay, leave it at that. Representative Underwood, to his point, you didn't really say whether you condemn acts of violence and looting. Here's your opportunity if you'd like to take it.
Yes, as I said before, Jim, I think it's really important that we continue to lift up the peaceful protesters, those who are exercising their First Amendment rights. But it is a tragedy when people are injured, when there's violence, when there's damage, and the like as a result of these types of demonstrations, and that's not appropriate.
Okay, thank you. Representative Underwood, how would you rate the federal government's response to COVID-19?
I think that it has been extraordinarily poor. The president has summed it up himself when he said, I take no responsibility at all. And as a result, here we are with nearly 190,000 Americans dead, 6 million Americans diagnosed. You know, we continue to lack personal protective equipment for our essential and frontline healthcare workers. The American people are seeking COVID tests and are still experiencing delays, 7-10 days without getting results back timely. We don't have free COVID treatment. We've seen that, you know, there's been continued undermining of states as they've been forced to compete with one another for essential supplies. And all of this is happening while our economy has fallen into a recession. And so I think that this lack of leadership coming out of the White House, their unwillingness to put forward a national plan to help our country recover from COVID-19 has been something that has been an extraordinary failure and has really hurt the American people and communities like ours. Even today, there's been news that's broken to suggest that the president intentionally misled the American people about his knowledge of how how severe COVID-19 could be among the American people, the type of severe illness that folks could present with, and that's just inappropriate. That's not real leadership. And when we think about a time when we have a once in a century pandemic, we need leaders in this country who are going to step forward, center the science and the facts, and speak to the American people in a way that will give them not just comfort, but an understanding of the actions that they can take to protect themselves and their families. And so now what are we're in the 14th district, we're battling two crises, a healthcare crisis and an economic crisis that, will continue on for the foreseeable future. In my role in the Congress, we have been focused on delivering COVID relief packages. Early in the spring, we passed a series of COVID relief packages in March and in April. And May 15th, we passed the HEROES Act, a comprehensive piece of COVID relief legislation that helps address the healthcare issues, the individual economic issues that families are facing, folks who can't pay their rent or can't pay their mortgage, families who are going hungry, and does support our small businesses to make sure that our economy can continue forward as employers. I have been so extremely dismayed at this partisanship that we've seen come out of the United States Senate, the president's representatives who have been unwilling to make a deal and negotiate. I am hopeful that as we return to Washington this weekend, we will be able to pass some additional COVID legislation to offer much needed relief to the American people.
Thank you. Senator Oberweis.
Jim, I've been very distressed by the extreme partisanship that's come out of the House, for heaven's sakes. They have taken this situation and tried to capture federal dollars for all kinds of pet projects that have nothing to do with this pandemic. And I think that's just fundamentally wrong. The politicization of this is very stressing. For heaven's sakes, the president was very early in recognizing the problem and in terminating air travel from China. And when he did that, he was criticized by Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats as overreacting to the situation. I think hindsight shows that he was absolutely right in doing that and probably saved many American lives and reduced some of the early stress from that. Now, having said that, I want you to know that I try to be fair in discussing these things. Certainly don't give him an A on this. I think he was way too late to recognize the importance of people wearing face coverings or masks when they're indoors and in close contact with other people. That's something that we have required at Oberweis Dairy. That's something that I've tried to follow indoors and not necessarily outdoors. I think the evidence is that when you're outdoors and you're a little distant from people, the danger is pretty minor. But it's another issue that shouldn't be a Republican issue or a Democrat issue. It shouldn't be brought into politics. It should be a healthcare issue. We should all be working together to find the best solutions that we possibly can. And when the voters in the 14th Congressional District send me to Washington, I will maintain that bipartisanship. I'll work across the aisle, as I have done for the last 8 years in Springfield. And on numerous occasions, I've stood on the floor of the Illinois Senate asking my colleagues to please vote yes on a bill if they think it's a good bill, or vote no if they think it's a bad bill, regardless of whether it's filed by and sponsored by a Republican or a Democrat. That shouldn't be the deciding point, and unfortunately, too often it is. We should be trying to make decisions on what is good for our district, what's good for our state, and also what's good for our country. And I pledge to you right now, that is exactly the attitude that I will take to Washington, D.C., and I will continue to follow it as long as I'm there. And by the way, I don't intend to be there forever. I'm a big believer in term limits. This was my 8th and final year serving in the Illinois Senate. I actually thought this winter I was going to have an opportunity to spend more time with my 24 grandkids. But when my opponent started voting like a radical socialist, people asked us to get involved, and I'm 100% focused on making sure that our district has representation in Washington who understands what it takes to encourage business people and entrepreneurs to risk their time, their energy, and their capital to create jobs and opportunities for other people. And that's what I've done for my whole life. So I understand that. My opponent has never been in the private sector, has never run a business, never had to balance a budget. And it's easy to say, oh, just spend more money. It's just taxpayers' money. Hey, let's do this and we'll provide more dollars for everything. Unfortunately, there is going to be a price to pay for that. And I'm concerned about the trillions of dollars that we've already spent. And it certainly looks like there's going to be another trillion spent, if not more. So, you know, my background is in financial services. I started a family of mutual funds. I ran a fund myself for more than 20 years. And I know that when we flood the markets with this kind of cash, historically that has led to more inflation at some point down the road, and more inflation will lead to higher interest rates. When those interest rates start going up and our country has 26, 27, 28 trillion dollars in debt, the interest alone on those funds is going to put real pressure on the economy. And that's something I'm very concerned about.
Okay. John, did you have another question?
Yeah, Representative Underwood, just a follow up to that. What are your thoughts on mask wearing, and do you feel like it differs at all from your opponent?
So the science and the evidence, and most importantly, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention recommendations are very clear, which is the American people should wear masks when they are not at home and interacting with anyone who is not from their household, period.
Okay. Representative Underwood, President Trump suggested that if Joe Biden were elected president, the suburbs would be imperiled. What's your response to that?
We've seen the president try to take all type of divisive tactics, try to divide us, try to make us fear our neighbors, because he believes that that helps his reelection campaign. But what I know about this community is this: when our neighbors get sick, we organize a meal train. When someone is away, we pick up their mail. And I believe that our community is one that is welcoming. Our community is one that is resilient. And our community is one that continues to grow. When I think of our state of Illinois, the 14th Congressional District are home to the counties that are growing. And so I think that the president is wrong in this instance. I think that it really is a shame that he's seeking to stoke fear in this kind of really divisive way. And I think that has no place in our politics. I also just wanted to respond to something that I've been hearing over and over, if I may. And that is, my opponent is trying to paint me as some kind of a radical. And my record is really clear that we have worked effectively with the president's administration to get 3 bipartisan bills signed into law. Thank you.
Okay. Very good, thank you. Senator Oberweis.
I think the record is very clear, 100% with Nancy Pelosi. That is what I think could be well defined as radical socialism, no question about that. There's no bipartisanship when you vote 100% with Nancy Pelosi. That certainly doesn't fit. And I think the question was, would suburbs be in danger if Joe Biden is elected? And I would have to broaden that. I don't think it's just the suburbs. I think the entire country will be in trouble. Look, until this pandemic hit, we had the strongest economy we've ever had. We had the lowest unemployment rates for women, the lowest unemployment rates for African Americans, the lowest unemployment rate for Latinos, the lowest unemployment rate for the entire country. The economy was humming along because the president was doing the right things by reducing regulations, keeping tax rates competitive with the rest of the world, and doing very good things to create more jobs and opportunities for people. That's what will be gone. Mr. Biden has already said the first thing he's going to do is increase taxes. How is that going to help create jobs for people? How is that going to help bring our economy back? I mean, this is unbelievable. It's not going to just hurt the 14th Congressional District. It's going to hurt the entire country. So I think that could be very, very dangerous. And I've lived I've lived in the Aurora area for my entire life. I've lived in the Fox Valley area. In fact, I've lived in my same house for the last 42 years. I think I know what is important to the people in the 14th Congressional District. And believe me, it's not the views of Nancy Pelosi.
If I could just follow up, Mr. Oberweis, John Lampman, Daily Herald. When the president made the remarks, he pretty clearly was talking about, and I'd like both of your opinions on this, pretty clearly talking about affordable housing. And in fact, I think at some point he said, you know, it would let the, poor people move in. So two questions. What is your position about, affordable housing, reducing the zoning restrictions? And second, was there a dog whistle in what he was saying? Is there a racial undertone to what he was saying? I'd like to hear what you have to say, Mr. Oberweis, and then Representative Underwood.
To the last part, not to my knowledge, but I will tell you that I have recently toured several affordable housing projects that are a perfect example of the government working with the private sector. These are not my father's affordable housing units. These are very nice units where people pay a limited amount based on their income, but they're new units. I just visited one in Batavia probably a month or two ago. There was something that I would be pleased to see my kids living in. They're very nice apartments. So I think this is a good example of how the government can work with the private sector. The government, when you think of private housing, I think of Cabrini Green in Chicago or some of these very challenged situations. And even in Aurora, we had some public housing that was certainly not nearly as nice as what we're seeing going up right now. So I firmly believe that that we're taking steps in the right direction, and certainly reducing regulations. In most cases, it's something that I would tend to, certainly some level of regulation is necessary. We certainly recognize that, but I think the government has gone, for the most part, way too far. And I think the president's comments or idea that, for every new regulation, I want to eliminate 2 or 3 or 4 of the old ones, boy, that speaks to my heart, I'll tell you that.
Shall I respond? Okay. Unfortunately, I think we just heard the same dog whistle coming from Mr. Oberweis as we did in Mr. Trump's original comment. Second thing is, with respect to affordable housing, we do have a number of affordable housing units across the 14th district, but not nearly enough. I've attended ribbon cuttings in McHenry and visited new complexes as they are built across this district. Huntley has some, Batavia and in the Fox Valley area has some, and I've even talked with some of the reporters from your own publications who have shared with me their concerns about the lack of affordable housing units in our community. This is something that is incredibly important. The federal tax credits are a project that continues to allow some of those to be built in our community, and I think that the president's remarks obviously do not reflect the values of the 14th Congressional District.
Okay. John Etheridge, you had a question.
John Etheridge with Shaw Media. Representative Underwood, what is your position on mail-in voting?
I think it's really important that the American people continue to have opportunities to participate safely in this election. Here in Illinois, we have had the opportunity to vote at home, even prior to 2020 and COVID-19. But I was very pleased to see Governor Pritzker expand access to vote by mail ahead of this election. I have been so dismayed by the recent policy changes put forth at the United States Postal Service, which have really decreased the American people's confidence in the reliable, timely service. And we've seen the new Postmaster General, Mr. DeJoy, take actions to take machines offline, limited staff, and certainly staff overtime, which has really impacted the service and delivery and reliability that we have come to count on in an agency that employs the most veterans in this country. We have 80% of veterans who get their prescription drugs from the mail. And so, you know, playing partisan politics in a time of an election is something that is simply un-American in my point of view. And so that's why I have been so pleased to champion a piece of legislation called the Delivering for America Act. I returned to Washington in August to vote on that legislation. And it does two things. One is it offers $25 billion to meet the funding needs requested by President Trump's appointed board of governors. They came to the Congress and said, as a result of the pandemic, they needed some additional funds. And we put it in the HEROES Act, and we also voted on that appropriation in the standalone bill, and then also restores the service delivery standards to what they were on January 1st, 2020, when the American people continue to have full confidence in the United States Postal Service. But to directly summarize and answer your question, yes, I support vote from home. I think it is the safe and reliable way for people to be able to participate in this election.
Senator Oberweis, what is your position on mail-in voting?
Thanks, John. I believe that this, again, shouldn't be a political issue. Certainly in this pandemic, it makes all kinds of sense to keep people safe. In fact, it has become a bit of a political issue because, at least in Springfield, some of the Democrats were not willing to listen to, I think, common sense suggestions. For instance, on the floor of the Senate, I proposed, let's not just mail-in ballot applications to those who voted in 2018. Let's mail them to all registered voters in the state of Illinois. And by the way, we can do that at no postal cost to people in this district by including it with the constitutional amendment. We're required to mail out the information on the constitutional amendment to every registered voter. So why not just include the mail-in ballot application with that, which literally would save millions of dollars across the state of Illinois? But they refused to listen to that suggestion, in my opinion, on a political basis, because they knew that Republican voting was strong in 2016, but not as strong in 2018. So they were concerned about getting it out to those higher percentage Democrat votes. And to me, that's just wrong. If we really believe this is going to make people safer, and I do, why not let everybody participate, for heaven's sakes? Why try to limit it to give an advantage to Democrats? That just seems totally partisan and totally unfair and shouldn't have happened. But it did. That's the legislation that ultimately passed. And that's what you get when you have a legislature that is so totally controlled by one party, as we have in Illinois. It's a shame, but you'd think that voters across the state would start to get the idea that maybe a total dominant power by one party is not the best thing, and would work on trying to reduce Mr. Madigan's influence. And you know, we could go on and on about Mr. Madigan, but clearly this guy has been abusive with power and controlled particularly the House, but even to a degree the Senate, and that has certainly not been good for the state of Illinois. When we go to the question about the Postal Service, it's my understanding that all of the restrictions that my opponent was talking about have been totally put on hold or stopped until after the election. Now, when we get past the election, here we have a Postal Service that is operating at continuing deficits. We need to find ways to use more business common sense practices to prevent those large deficits that have been occurring. And we can debate and talk about what the best ways to solve that are after the election, but clearly up until the election, no changes are being made. So we can, I think, rely on the Postal Service to continue to deliver help. And as I said, I do support mail-in ballots, particularly in this pandemic situation that we're in today.
I think you're muted, Jim.
I broke my own rule. Sorry about that. Senator Oberweis, believe it or not, the Affordable Care Act has been around for more than 10 years now, 10 years and a few months. What's your assessment of it today, and what can or should be done to improve upon it?
Jim, unfortunately, I believe that too many people on the other side of the aisle are trying to find ways to go to a single payer system where it's totally controlled by the government. I don't think that's good for citizens of this country or people in our district. I believe that there are things that we can do. First of all, we ought to provide more transparency. People ought to know what these services cost. And secondly, we need to have more competition to help bring down prices. Some of the things that the president is doing, like now allowing the reimportation of American-made drugs from Canada, is exactly the right thing, because so far, we American citizens have in effect been required to pay all the R&D costs for the many drug discoveries that we have in this country. And this country has been very productive. More than 50% of all drugs discovered in the entire world are discovered right here in the United States. I don't want to stop that effective way to find new ways to make people's lives better. But I think that those who benefit from those drugs ought to share equally in the costs. And what has happened is drug companies have sold to the one Canadian buyer, the government, at a lower price than they have sold to American suppliers. And I think that's fundamentally wrong. If you eliminate the barrier, then Americans could buy their prescriptions from a CVS in Toronto, for example, and equalize those prices pretty quickly. So that would clearly be a step in the right direction. I will tell you also that in Springfield, I introduced legislation, which was the right to shop for elective surgery. And under that bill, it would have required insurance companies to post on their website the average in-network price for certain elective surgeries, like, let's say, a hip replacement or a knee replacement. It would then have allowed potential patients to shop if they wish to, purely voluntary. But if they wish to, they could look around, and if they found a provider who would provide that service at a price lower than the average in-network price, they could go out of network, the insurance company would pay, and they would get to keep half of the savings. More competition, good idea. And the insurance company would get to keep the other half. I mean, that seems like a win-win. And you'd think that that would just be something that would be immediately obvious to most people. And in fact, it was. I worked on a bipartisan basis, and we ended up, if I remember correctly, I think with 17 Republican sponsors and 18 Democrat sponsors. That's 35 votes. It takes only 30 votes to pass legislation in the Illinois Senate because there are 59. Do you think this passed even though it had 35 sponsors? Answer, not in Illinois, because the leadership has too much power. They can prevent such a bill from being heard in committee, even when you have enough sponsors on a bill to pass it with just the sponsors, not the other people voting for it. That's a shame. And that's what we get from Mike Madigan. That's the way he's run this state for way too many years and run it into the ground and created 137 billion unfunded liability, creating a situation where Commonwealth Edison has paid $200 million to settle claims of bribery to Mike Madigan's friends. And Illinois used to be such a great state. I was so proud to be from Illinois. We got great advantages. Some of the best farmland in the world. We're the #1 soybean producer, the #2 corn producer. Great transportation hub from trains to the Great Lakes, to our expressways that go through the state of Illinois, to one of the best and busiest airports in the world, to some of the best universities. I mean, the University of Illinois, University of Chicago, Northwestern are internationally renowned, incredible institutions. And yet the politicians have destroyed this state so badly that sometimes I'm almost embarrassed to say I'm from Illinois when I meet people from other states. It shouldn't be that way. Great advantages. It's the politicians that have made this a mess.
You kind of sound like you're running for state senate again, sir.
Not at all.
Okay.
I'm done with my 8th and final year. I believe in term limits.
All right, very good. Representative Underwood.
Well, I'm a nurse and I believe that healthcare is a human right. And in Congress, I've been focused on protecting coverage for people with pre-existing conditions. We've been working to lower the cost of prescription drugs and increasing access to affordable, high-quality healthcare, including maternal healthcare, mental healthcare, and reproductive healthcare. Meanwhile, the Trump administration has been in court suing to dismantle the Affordable Care Act and the protections that the law provides during a pandemic. And if that lawsuit is successful, 20 million Americans will lose the health care coverage that they count on. I passed an amendment to make sure that no federal dollars could be used to support that outrageous undertaking. But I didn't stop there. I have been introducing original bills and pieces of legislation, including our Lower Insulin Costs Now Act that we discussed earlier, that was signed into law by President Trump. I passed the Healthcare Portability Act, the bill that says that no Americans would pay more than 8.5% of their adjusted gross income on premiums. And that was adopted in the Affordable Care Enhancement Act that the House passed on a bipartisan basis in June. I should also add, by the way, that my amendment about not paying for this outrageous lawsuit passed the House in a bipartisan way this summer. So just so that we're very clear on my bipartisan record of achievement, we were able to pass legislation to lower prescription drug prices and allow Medicare to negotiate those drug prices. I passed legislation unanimously out of the House of Representatives on mental health care. It's called the Veterans Care Quality and Transparency Act. And so, you know, we know that healthcare is an important issue on the minds of voters here in the 14th Congressional District. And we've heard Senator Oberweis say that he supports protections for people with pre-existing conditions. And we heard that same line from our former Republican congressman. But the truth is that the legislation that Mr. Oberweis supports would not provide those protections. And we even had a contrast piece published in one of your papers, the Northwest Herald, outlining the differences in our healthcare approaches. And the reporter came to the same conclusion. As a nurse, I know that reproductive healthcare is healthcare, and I find Senator Oberweis's on-the-record statements supporting limiting access to birth control, banning a woman's right to choose, and outlawing abortion, even in cases of rape, to be very disturbing. His views, frankly, are radical, and they are out of touch with the people in our community.
So, Senator Oberweis, first, I'm sure you want to rebut that. Second, do you also believe that healthcare is a human right?
Look, I do believe in the right to life, and my opponent supports absolute unlimited abortion at any time. And I think that's fundamentally wrong and not in line with people in this district. And she talked about being bipartisan. Look, she has been rated 344th out of 435 congressmen for lack of partisanship, lack of being bipartisan. She's one of the most partisan members of the entire Congress. So to sit there and tell people that she's bipartisan, that's an insult to the intelligence of people who are listening to that. That's just not right, and that kind of stuff shouldn't happen. The numbers and the facts are there. When she talks about having 3 bills signed, for heaven's sakes, those obviously were incorporated into other bills, as I think Russell had mentioned way back at the beginning of this discussion. And when you control a part of the legislature, as the Democrats do the House, she should be able to get every single bill that she ever proposed through the House, at least. And I believe she had proposed, I think, something like 28 bills, and only a very few of those even passed her own party in the House. And again, when you talk about partisanship, nobody can claim to be bipartisan if they vote 100% of the time with Nancy Pelosi. Look, this is just, this doesn't make sense. It's not acceptable.
John, you have a final question for us?
Yes, I guess I would go to Mr. Oberweis and then Representative Underwood. Senator, I want to give you both the chance to make your case for, in a minute or so, your case for why people should vote for you over your opponent.
Did you want me first, did you say?
Yes, Senator Oberweis.
Yeah. Look, I've lived in this district for 42 years. I understand the needs of this district. I understand what it takes to encourage people to create jobs and opportunities. After my brother had a stroke, I bought Oberweis Dairy from him. And since that time, we've grown it from 50 employees to well over 1,200 employees. I've spent my entire career in the private sector creating jobs and opportunities for people. My opponent has never done that. She doesn't have that experience. She may be a very nice person, but she just doesn't have the experience that is so necessary to represent the views of this district in Washington. It's not fair to say that she can vote 100% of the time with Nancy Pelosi and therefore represent the views of people in the 14th Congressional District, because those two are not compatible. It doesn't make any sense. So I think it's critical that we have people with experience, and that is really what I've done. I think I have a quote here, if I can read it. I believe it was from Cicero, and if it were not for the elders correcting the mistakes of the young, there would be no state. I've got that experience, and I'm, as Ronald Reagan said, I want to try not to hold my opponent's youth and lack of experience against her, but there's no substituting for having many years of experience in the private sector and understanding what it takes to help grow this economy, and that's where my strength is.
Well, I want to thank the editorial boards for having me today. I think the voters have a really clear choice in this race. I'm focused on listening to the challenges people are facing here in our community in Northern Illinois and focus on getting results for our community. My opponent's statements today show just how out of touch he is with our community. Mr. Oberweis has used his time to distort and attack my record today. He's talked about his volunteer work in Chicago, and I've heard so very few policy proposals. Our community has a clear choice. I mean, I focused on getting results for people in 14th District, high quality healthcare, protecting our community from COVID-19. I'm proud to say that my team and I have been really effective over the past year and a half, whether it's securing free COVID testing for people, making lower cost generic insulin available sooner to families who need it, and standing up for our farmers during the trade war with China. Since being sworn into Congress, I voted to support federal programs that have brought over $1 billion into the 14th District to fund small business loans, cutting edge science at Fermilab, and other grants and federal contracts that support good jobs and services in our community. To me, the most important part of my job in Congress is bringing the voices and the values of Northern Illinois to Congress. And when I think about the values that our community holds dear, I think about the relationships that we have with our neighbors. And I think that a lot of your questions really spoke to that today. We look out for one another in our community, and we refuse to give in to the cynical politics that would have us regard our neighbors with fear and suspicion. I think that the biggest difference between my opponent and I is that I want to bring our community together. I want to provide the resources that our families need during this crisis, and I want to ensure that all of our families have access to the high quality healthcare that they need to survive COVID-19 if they get diagnosed. Okay, I want every single family in our community to have access to the paid family leave that they need, so no one has to choose between getting a paycheck and caring for a sick child. Those are the values that I bring to Congress. Those are the values that I was raised with here in Northern Illinois, and it has been an honor, the honor of my life, to represent this community in Congress. I thank you again for having me and for creating space for this conversation. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. This concludes today's interview. I want to thank both Representative Underwood and Senator Oberweis for their time and participation. Good luck to both of you on your campaigns. The election's November 3rd, but early voting, including mail-in voting, begins around September 24th. We encourage all voters to research the candidates and issue in all the races, and to make good use of the Daily Herald and dailyherald.com, as well as Shaw Media's various publications and websites as part of that research. Ultimately, voting is one of the most sacred obligations a citizen has if a democracy is to flourish, and we encourage you to vote. Thank you for all watching, and stay well. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.